Hi everyone, I'm Carlos Linares, and this is the Chalk Talk with Geoff Ewenson on starts.
Hey everybody, sorry we're a little late, a couple technical issues we were trying to sort out, but thank you all for taking the time on a beautiful Sunday afternoon in Annapolis to join us. Not exactly a great day for us to be sailing, so it's good to be talking about sailing. And today, I'm just going to answer some questions that have been sent in prior to this, and feel free to write in questions into the comments, and Carlos will feed those to me. But today we're talking about, in general, just starting, and some ideas that I have on starting, and what I think is important. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in, but we'll just get into it. I think before we get into any questions, I think one thing that I like to say to people that I'm sailing with, whether it's as a tactician or just to the team, that if I'm driving, the key to any start and the mark of a successful start is if you can get off of the line and sail in a straight line for anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes, depending on the size of the boat and the length of the course, without being dictated to, then you've had a successful start. That means that you've started in the first row, and no boat has pinched you off or rolled you and forced you to tack because you're in dirty air. So if you break it down to its simplicity, if you can just start the boat and go straight for 3 to 5 minutes, you've probably had a very successful start. And methods to getting that and achieving that with some consistency is what this is going to be all about. One of the other things that I talk about a lot with teams that I sail with is having a consistent plan that we go through every time to try and achieve that consistent start. And I call it a flight plan. And so typically the boats that I've been sailing on recently are anywhere from 20 footers to 50 footers. And depending on the length of the line, and you can see in the back here, I've drawn in a start line. You've got the wind coming down from the top. We've got the race committee boat. We have the pin. I think you can see these dotted lines that I've drawn down. These are lay lines from either end of the line. And then along the bottom, and I'll draw it in a little bit darker, I call this the baseline. And basically, I consider this to be my starting box. That starting box might extend out just a little bit out here. And you might even consider that it starts out here and comes down as well. That's your starting box. And this depth changes depending on the wind strength and the current and just the general conditions that you're going to be going through leading up to the start. So this could be, it could be 3 boat lengths, or it could be 10 boat lengths, depending on the conditions and the current. But that's something that we talk about before sort of each start, each individual start during the course of the day. We will set what that bottom baseline is. And just very quickly, I'll talk about what the flight pattern is, and then we'll get into the start line, the starting questions, sorry. So if we're going to assume that we have a 5-minute start, if the line is 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes long, I always pick a time that I want to be passing the pin end. Now, I set a certain time, X. Typically, if it's a 5-minute start, I want to be passing the pin sometime between 2.5 and 3 minutes to go to the start. And I am sailing on a broad reach on port down to my predetermined baseline. And what that allows me to do is, if I pass here at 3 minutes and I sail downwind to a base and then sail along a baseline and I get to 1:30 to go, I know that I am barely on time to get back and sail up towards the pin and make it. So it's not exactly a Vanderbilt start, but it just gives me a reference point to be using. And if I have that same reference point all the time, then the crew starts to see the pattern. And if we want to get a start that wins near the boat, well, then we can sail past that 1:30 and tack onto our final approach coming in towards the boat. But if we want to have that pin end or pin third start, we need to be turning sometime before 1.5 minutes. Does that make sense? I hope so. So that's my standard flight pattern: is predetermine a time, sail down to a base depth, sail along the base depth, final turn, and then turn up wherever it is that you want to be getting off of the starting line. And one of my big principles is you can't win the regatta by winning one start, but you can lose a regatta pretty easily, and certainly lose the race by losing the start. Yeah. So setting up this plan, if you will, that has some reliability and some consistency to it, helps to achieve that high success rate. You're not going to win every start, but you want to have a clean lane, clean enough that you can sail in that 3 to 5 minutes in a straight line. So we'll probably come back to that flight plan throughout this chat, but I just wanted to go over that real quick before we got into the questions. So, Carlos, if you have questions that you'd like to go through, I suggest we do that now.
Okay, well, to start you off, we have Ava Farley writing in on Instagram with the following. What's your pre-start homework and routine?
It's a good one. I think the pre-start homework and your routine really starts almost from the moment you get to the boat. It's easy just to think of the sailboat race as starting once you're in the starting area. But I think it's actually really important to have the right mindset and be in race mode. You can switch off if you need to take a little break, but to be in race mode really on the way out to the race course. And one of the things that I like to talk about just on the sail out is what kind of a day is it? We racing here in Annapolis, we can pick a normal sort of summer day out on the bay. Let's say it's the perfect sea breeze is filled in and it's sort of 7 to 8 knots, maybe building to 10 throughout the course of the afternoon. And one of the big factors here on the bay is what's the current doing. So that certainly factors into your discussion on the way to the race course. How important is current in this, in today? What is the key factor to the day? And quite often here on the Chesapeake, current plays a big role. On a post-frontal day, when we have some kind of a westerly here on the bay, those tend to be very shifty, puffy days. And so current might be a factor, but is it the biggest factor? Well, being able to get off of the line and hit the shifts is probably the biggest factor. So that factors into the discussion as you head out to the race course. And that's why I think setting up the tune of the boat for one design boats is really important. And all that happens before you even arrive at the starting area. I like to, as just part of my routine, sail past the transom of the committee boat on starboard tack and just say hello. Whether or not it's required is almost irrelevant. The check-in may or may not be required, but I think it's a really important part of getting everybody in the right frame of mind, and heck, even knowing that the race committee has seen you and know that you're ready to race, and you can sort of get a sense for how ready they are too, which, some race committees are more ready than others. So I think that's pretty important. And I also, in that, I like to be one of the earlier boats out to the race course. And if I can, it pays to find a like-minded other boat that also wants to get out, do a little bit of training, and arrive early and check in and try to line up with somebody so that you get a sense for how well you're going. If there's something right with your setup or wrong with your setup, you're going to know about it really quickly. And I like to prearrange a meeting with another boat at or near the race committee boat, and that gives us a central spot. And then we go upwind on starboard for, say, 3 minutes. We both tack over and sail on port for 3 minutes. And then the leeward boat, the right-hand boat, will tack. And, I'll do this. So we've sailed upwind on starboard. We've both tacked. We've sailed upwind on port. And now the leeward boat will tack and duck. And we'll do a split. And we'll do 3 minutes out and 3 minutes back and determine which side won. Hopefully in the first 2 tacks, the first starboard long and port long, you've determined that you're going about the same speed, so any split will show a difference in the wind or the current or something like that. And then turn downwind and discuss. Once you get back to each other, if one boat's crossing or the other boat's crossing, sort of get to a point where it's obvious who's won, and then both turn down and discuss what you think you learned. It could be that, it's a little bit shifty, and so I think I just got the last shift, and that's why I was crossing. Or, geez, I went over there and I saw a crab pot that had no current, but when we were going upwind before, there was lots of current, and so I think it's a current thing. And I think sharing that information between 2 boats is really good. That's part of my pre-race, pre-start routine. Once you've sailed downwind, you get back to the starting area, and I think different boats have different allowances. Some boats have GPS units that are allowed on board. A lot of dinghies don't have that technology, but if you do have that, you're on a J24 or a J70 or a Viper. If you're allowed to ping the ends, it's literally you just sail to the pin end and sail to the boat end, and as your bow gets to that spot, you push the button and say, ping the pin. And then you sail the other end, ping the boat. And now you've determined those 2 places, and your unit knows where you are, and so it will give you a relative distance off of the line. And that's something that we use in setting what that baseline is for different wind conditions. So you'll ping the ends of the line, and if possible, while you're sailing from one end of the line to the other to get a ping in, just hit your stopwatch. How long does it take to get from the boat end to the pin end? And that starts to factor into my mind, if I'm passing here at a certain time, how long is it going to take me to get down to the boat? So those are all, they help in my internal clock to know where I am on the line. Once I've determined those things, I will sail up to one end of the line, the boat end typically, and I'll get my line sight. And that could be an entire different talk just on line sights, but effectively what I'm doing is I'm looking through the pin and I'm finding something on land out here, and that is my transit. And if anybody wants to write in questions about that specifically, we can go into depth, but I'm going to assume that most people know what transits are. Once I get that transit, I will then sail back down the line, maybe take a wind shot. As I'm sailing down the line, I notice what that heading is. Then when I turn up and get a wind shot, I compare that heading to this heading, and I get to determine which end of the line is favored. You know, the laser sailors that don't have a compass, you just sort of sail into the middle and you point your boat upwind, and if your boat is pointed a little more this way, you notice the pin appears to be further forward. That's how you determine which end is favored. But I like to do it with a little bit of math as well, and throw in the actual headings and do the math in my head, because it's really hard to determine if it's only a 3, 4, 5 degree favored end. But if it's a long line, that makes a big difference. And then finally, once I've determined which end is favored, I will then sail back down and try to get a transit on this dotted line here, so that I know that as I'm sailing down the line for my final turn up, I know what that transit is. If I'm below it, I'm going to have a hard time making the pin. As I'm getting down here, I'm getting closer and closer to that transit. I know that I'm getting to the bottom end. So that's sort of all the homework stuff, is really working on getting those ley lines, figuring out which end is favored, and pinging the line if possible. Once I have all of that done, we can either take a 2-minute break and grab a little bit of water, but generally what I'd like to do at that point is then sail back and do a time practice start. And that could be, you know, as short as a 2-minute start. And if I'm on a boat that has a bow team, we'll actually all sync our watches and say, okay, 2 minutes. And we will roll through just a simple practice approach. And what that does is it allows the trimming team and the driver and the bow team to go through a couple of accelerations to figure out how the boat is launching in these specific conditions. So that's something that you try to do prior to every race. It's a little hard to do if you get out late, which is why I think it's important to get out early. But going through that pre-start, getting all your homework done, and then having time to do at least 2 or 3 practice launches, I call it, so that everybody's in sync. And then it's easier when other boats get added to the mix. And I think if you look around, you'll see a lot of other boats at the same time are doing that same sort of practice launch program. So that's all my pre-start stuff.
Well, that answers Bryce RiceWoolf's first question, which was, what's the first thing you do at the start? The next thing he asks is, how does your starting system change based on an upwind or a downwind start?
So at the end of the day, the desired goal is the same. You want to be able to get off of the line and continue going in the direction that you planned on going without being dictated by anybody else. The challenge is when you have a successful upwind start, then you get out into the front row and you have the cleanest of air. When you have a successful downwind start, you get out in the front row and everybody behind you is throwing a wind shadow. So I feel like successful downwind starts typically tend to be near the ends and running to the outside, trying to get away from the pack of boats that are all trying to fill in. So having some kind of a successful start that gets you to the outside quickly. And I think there's a lot of factors. If you're sailing on a Wednesday night PHRF race where the boats are all different sizes, and you can expect that no matter what you do, some boats might just be faster through the water. Well, that's a whole nother level of complexity that makes it more difficult. But I think at the end, the goal is typically to get a clean start out to an end. And if you can start over here on starboard and sail out to the outside of the pack, that's great. And if you can sail here and approach on starboard so that anybody that's approaching on port has to get out of your way and jibe straight around the corner so that you are now the windward boat leading out to the left, is another successful option. Does that answer that question?
Yes.
All right.
Let's see. Rachel O'Neill asks, switch it back. Rachel O'Neill asks, when do you approach the starting line, and how do you keep a clear slot in keelboats?
So this is really good. And it's something that I think, as I said, we're going to come back to that pattern, that flight plan. I think the challenge in bigger boats is figuring out what that base depth is and planning your timing back to the line so that after you've tacked, you have just slightly more time than you have distance. So what I mean is, if I were to tack here and sail full speed, I would arrive at the line somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds early. And so what I need to do is I need to tack and just have a little bit of slowdown time and have room to accelerate and get off the line. Now, I think she asked, how do you protect that gap? And I think there's a couple of ways to do it. Being deeper in the line allows you some perspective on what the fleet is doing. So if I see a bunch of boats up here, I'm going to erase mine. I'll do a better job here. I see a bunch of boats coming into the committee boat, and then there's a bunch of boats crammed in down by the pin, but there's only a few in the middle. If I have some depth, and obviously I'm exaggerating this a little bit, I'm putting them all right on the line, but the more depth you have, the more perspective you get for seeing these gaps. And so having this depth on port allows you to see the approaching boats and get some idea for where the thin spots are. And I think that one of the keys to getting off that line and being able to go straight is starting in what I call a low density area. So if the line is generally square and the course is generally square, then what I'm really keying in on is starting in one of these gaps, which allows me more opportunity to come off the line and sail in a straight line for that 3 to 5 minutes. In a dinghy, that tends to be a little bit harder. For some reason, dinghy starts tend to be more crowded. There's less room between boats. But I think if you do a few YouTube searches and look for different starting videos, you'll find that even in those typically what seem to be very crowded starts, there are low density areas that you can tuck into. And so ultimately, if you can find a low density area, then your gap is easier to hold. If you can't find a low density area, or you're sailing, say, local TSOD Tuesday evening Series 1 design, and you're in your 420, and there's 15 boats for what seems to be a 12-boat line, well, that's when your boat handling comes into play, And it's really all about being able to stop your boat and start your boat. And that's where, in that pre-start routine where you're practicing your launches on a dinghy like a 420, where you know you're going to need to basically be sitting, luffing right on the line, and then put the bow down and accelerate in a tiny little space. If you do 10 of those practices prior to the race, you and your crew or you and your skipper are going to have a better understanding for what is it going to take to get the boat in these conditions to go from effectively 0 to full speed as fast as possible.
Okay. Let's see.
And Carlos, sorry.
Sure. Go ahead.
Made me think a little bit. The initial part of the question was more in keelboats, and so I think having that pre-start, that launch sequence that we've practiced really helps the trimmers get in sync. The jib trimmer might pull in just a little bit earlier than the main trimmer to help the bow pull down. And then once the bow starts to turn, the jib trimmer eases and the main fills. And now they're both sort of balanced. And then we're pulling both sails in together, and that helps the boat to ramp up and go through sort of the shifting gears. And so I didn't want to just end on the dinghy side because the question talks about the keelboats. I think that's where that launch repetition comes into play. And so having those, 2 or 3 practices, and you can even do that on the way to the line. If you know you're going to be early, while you're sailing out and everybody's sort of getting geared up, if it's a long straight line out to, say, R2, where the starting area is going to be, and it happens to be sort of upwind, you can do the sort of high and slow, luff, slow the boat down, and then accelerate. Sail for a little bit, and then, again, high and slow the boat down. Okay, everybody, we're going to practice accelerating in 3, 2, 1, boom, everybody pulls in, bear away, trim the sails correctly, and then as you turn up, the sails trim in together so that they're working as a pair. Sorry, I didn't want to end on the dinghy thing too much.
Sure, no worries.
Yep.
So our next question is Bryce RiceWoolf again. What do you, the skipper, look for, and what does your crew look for at the start? Are there some things that are specifically yours or theirs, or do you collaborate on everything?
So I think that delegating is a good thing, but it takes practice. And I can sort of think of 2 scenarios. I'm sailing my 420 or Viper or FJ, something that has 2 or 3 people, and I consider it the skipper's job to be looking forward and to leeward. And basically anything forward of 90 degrees to the boat, and specifically more forward and to the leeward 90 degrees to the boat, because it's pretty hard as a driver to do this. But the crew is giving feedback on everything that's happening from to windward and behind. And if we're sailing on a boat where it's hard to see under the boom, the crew might be sitting down and the skipper is sitting up. The crew could also be calling what's underneath the boom. So I do think delegating that is pretty important. And again, on your way out to the course, just a little quick, hey guys, let's remember, when we do our final approach to the line, there's a lot going on. I want you to be talking about boats that are coming in from behind, and I want you to be calling relative speed to the boats next to us, whether it's to windward or to leeward. Generally, if I'm the driver, I can see the relative speed of the boat to leeward, but I miss the boat that's over my shoulder, and it's important to know when they start to accelerate so that we don't get rolled. And again, that comes in that talking on the way out to the line. You can delegate those responsibilities, but generally I think of the skipper looks forward and just slightly to leeward, and the crew looks basically behind me to cover my butt.
Makes sense.
Yep.
Bryce writes in with a related question. Does the crew or skipper call tactics on the start, and what about the race?
So that is very dependent on who you're sailing with, what kind of boat it is. And so we're going to watch a video at the end that shows the communication on a 52, and that will be a very good indicator of who is calling the shots. I know that when I'm doing tactics, quite often I am relaying what I would like the driver to do, and yet there are times if I'm doing tactics but I know that the driver is, say, some college All-American, I can be pretty hands-off and say, hey, I'd really like just to go and win the pin or win the boat. And that's kind of it. It's more of a big picture strategy, and I let the driver do the boat-to-boat negotiating, if you will. So I think that typically the driver deals with the boat-to-boat interactions, because ultimately if two boats hit and I'm not holding the tiller, while I may have not done a very good job of communicating, it's the person that's holding the tiller that is responsible for whether or not you touch boats. And so I think the boat-to-boat interactions really come down to who is driving, and the tactician really is advising more than anything. Did that answer that question?
I think so.
Yeah.
Don't see any follow-ups in the chat.
Okay.
So, but I'll keep an eye on that.
Yep.
Let's see. And you answered most of this already, but Bryce's final question is, what are your top 5 tips for people on the starting line?
So, again, I actually think it can be as simple as you're sailing out to the line, remind everybody on the boat that the success or failure is pretty obvious within the first 1 minute. It's a full success if you can go straight for 3 minutes, and it's a pretty rough start, and you're starting on your back foot if you're forced to tack away in the first 30 seconds. So having that conversation and reminding everybody what success looks like. Doing those practice launches helps everybody get in sync for what it's going to take to make this particular boat go from down speed to full speed in the minimum amount of time today. And the conditions, as we all know, changes every single day. So what might work in one condition certainly won't work in another condition. And it's important to get everybody on the same page and in the same mindset for the conditions that we're playing with on any given day for any given start. Going through all of that homework, making sure that you have the time to get out and sail upwind for a little bit and get a sense for what the conditions are. Make sure that you have time to religiously get your line sights. If you have the option and you're allowed, ping the ends and ping them again. Anytime you think something wasn't perfect, ping it again. And remember, if you do have that option and you do have a GPS option to ping the ends, those boats are on anchors and they move. You know, the anchor, and I'll just draw this out real quick. Pardon me. If this is the bottom, and here's the water, and here's the committee boat, and they've got an anchor that comes down like this, and a puff of wind hits them, they're going to maybe slide back to here, and that anchor is going to go more straight. Now, you might have pinged them here, but now they're down here. So if you start if this is your sailboat, and this is your race committee boat, you were exactly where your ping said you were, but the race committee boat moved. So when you do set pings, I always tend to try to set them a little bit what I call conservative, maybe 1 or 2 meters below where I think the actual line is. And just understand that that boat will move fore and aft with current, with wind. Really there's a lot of factors that go in. So just because you have that GPS and it says you were at exactly 0 at exactly the gun, that's not necessarily going to save you from being called over. So be a little bit conservative. And I had a coach who, if we crossed the line at exactly 0 at full speed, that was a B- start. But if we crossed the line 2 to 3 seconds after the gun at full speed, that was an A+ start. So think about that. The risk reward there, you'd really rather be going full speed 2 seconds off the line and not get called over than be that person that's pushing it, and every 3 or 4 starts you find yourself over early. That's not a way to be successful in a regatta.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, so we have a final question from Rachel O'Neill. What does your communication with your crew look like during the start sequence?
Yeah, this is perfect, and I think it really depends on the boat. But I think a great example is the video that Carlos, you and I have talked about, and I think you're going to tee up here. But before we get into that, I think whoever is calling the line, whether that's the driver or the tactician, and I don't mean the bowman specifically, although they are calling the line, and you'll see that in this video. On a big boat, the driver, the tactician, and the navigator really all work in a small communication loop, and then the tactician branches out of that loop to the speed team, which is the trimmers. And the bowman will be standing on the front of the boat, giving information really only that factors into that into the driver, tactician, and navigator little communication loop. On a smaller boat like a Viper, it can be one person calling distance to the line, and that's because we are allowed to have that GPS. And typically, if I'm the driver, I call half speed, full speed, go, or full stop, things like that. And really, I'm getting the information from the middle person about distance to the line, and they are also calling relative speed compared to the boats around us. And then the forwardmost person is the jib trimmer, and so they are listening for that acceleration call, that half speed, full stop call. But I think a great way to end this is if we wanted to watch that video, which comes from the guys on, are we going to do the platoon one or the quantum racing one?
Up to you. I've got the platoon and Tactician Terry. Those are the two.
Why don't we do Tactician Terry Hutchinson from here on the bay, here in Annapolis, good friend of Spin Sheet magazines, and a great friend of all Annapolis sailing, and certainly one of our big rock stars from this area, somebody we can all sort of hope to be as good as someday, including me. But I think this is a really good depiction of exactly what the communication looks like on a fully professional TP52, and it's something that maybe people can take away from and use on their own boats. That maybe not exactly the same communication, but the same style. I think you'll understand sort of very quickly who has what roles. And the voice that you hear most clearly is Terry Hutchinson, but then you can hear a few other voices in the background. They weren't specifically mic'd up, but they're all standing close enough that you hear them. And you get a sense for what the input is and then Terry giving the directive to the driver for how he wants the boat to come off the line. So let's break and go to that.
40, 11 lengths.
Where are we with the jibe?
I'll just turn my volume up just slightly.
No higher.
So
a little bit of a lefty right now out
can
of
you
the
hit
tack,
pause
okay?
here? In 3, 2, 1, hit pause.
Okay, paused at 244.
So right now you have that parade of boats on port coming from the pin, heading down, sort of meandering this way. And I'm just freehanding this in. There's the line. Here's the race committee boat.
Oh.
Here are the ley lines. This is the crowd of boats sort of coming in this way. So we're going to restart it here in 3, 2, 1.
No lower in here.
Start.
How many lengths?
And again, if you can,
How much you killing? Killing
maybe
a
we'll
minute.
post the link to
No
this
lower.
video
Attacking midline.
afterwards so that people can go back and watch this
Nice
video.
angle.
I
How
think
much
this
you
is
killing?
great.
Absolutely. We'll put it in the comments.
Just a very good example of the communication
trimming up in
and
here
what
and
kind
tacking.
of
Following Bronasek. Harder
roles
turn,
get
please.
handed off to different people.
Coming out deep once you get out of the tack
So
for
you can
us.
see
Bow's coming
they
down.
are making their final tack, what they think their
Keep
final
your bow
tack
down.
is.
Keep your bow down.
And you'll
Killing
hear in this
40.
video, there's some,
And hard up.
Terry starts
Hard
asking
up.
a bunch of
Hard up.
questions.
Hard up.
And the questions he's asking is of
Half
the
tap.
navigator
Hold it straight,
holding
do
a
not.
computer that is
Yep.
telling
Holding
them
straight.
their time and
Maybe only
distance,
killing 25.
where they are relative to the line, and how much time
Okay, this is our
it's going
spot
to take
here,
them
bro,
to get
okay?
to the line, and therefore their time.
Gladiators up. Keep killing 1-5. Keep your bow up. Keep your bow up. Keep your bow up.
Every time you hear him say killing, he's talking about that.
Keep it going for a little. Yep, nice, nice. That's good there. Killing 10. Getting a little speed here. Just inside close hold. Okay, taking a bite up in there. That's good there.
You can actually
Yeah.
see the
Keep your bow
navigator
up.
in the
Keep your bow
bottom
up.
right holding the tablet.
One maneuver here,
That's
no
giving
higher.
them all that
That's
information.
nice. 5 knots. Be ready for a big hike here, guys. No lower. Okay. Little mateys. Bow's
You
coming
can see in
down.
the top of the video
Easy.
just
No lower. No
how
lower. How we
tight the
doing?
feet is
No higher.
to the line,
No
but they're
higher.
not really necessarily super tight
Bow
to
down.
each other. Everybody's
Too
found their
early.
space.
Bow down. Bow down. Bow down. Aim below sled. Okay. Hold straight. Hold straight. Go. 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 Smooth. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going.
So there you go. Now I think we can cut from that. That gives you a sense for what a professional team looks like and sounds like. There's not a lot of yelling or chatter.
Big
It's
hike,
really,
boys. Big hike, boys.
It's actually quite a quiet boat, and what you really get is in that situation you have the tactician talking to the driver, asking questions of the navigator, and really there was almost no luffing. There was very little communication to the speed team. The speed team's just done it enough that they kind of know what the launch pattern looks like, and they're killing speed by how they're turning the boat. And the trim team is just trimming the sails to wherever the boat is pointing. So I think that's a great way to wrap up. If anybody has any questions, either put them in the comments or feel free to reach out directly to me. And it's easy to find me. We'll put my email in the section below, if that's all right. And thanks to SSA for letting me come and do this talk. And hope you all read Spin Sheet Magazine. And yeah, thank you very much.